This is a video lecture on the endocrine system in exchange for lab tonight. You should watch this, and there's a lot of factual memorization in this chapter. So the main focus is really going to be on naming those endocrine glands, their location, the hormones that they secrete, which could be several in some cases, as well as the disorders that are involved with each of these glands. So first of all, looking at location for these endocrine organs or glands, there are three in the brain. And so this one is review really. That is the hypothalamus. And you're going to see the hypothalamus is really the main control center for this whole system. You can kind of see with its proximity to the pituitary, that's one of the glands that it's going to directly control. But then a lot of the hormones secreted by the pituitary are going to affect these other organs as well. There's a third one that you can't really see in this picture. It's here in blue, and that's the pineal gland. In the throat, we have the thyroid. That's that butterfly-shaped gland. And then here's a kind of a close-up of that thyroid. You can see those four parathyroid glands that are on there. And this one here looks like it's pointing to the heart, but actually it's pointing to the thymus. And so remember, the thymus would be in that pericardium, which is the sac around the heart. Here's the pancreas. On top of the kidneys, we have the two adrenal glands. Those are those small little triangles on top of the kidneys. And then for the gonads, we have the testes and we have the ovaries. And we'll be hitting those more when we get to the reproductive system. So first of all, I want you to know the difference between an endocrine and an exocrine gland. So one of the main differences is if the gland has ducts, it's an exocrine gland. So an example would be, oil glands, sweat glands, even the pancreas is really exocrine and endocrine. So we say that it is a heterocrine gland. So the pancreas has two different types of cells. The exocrine glands are the ones that are going to be secreting the digestive enzymes and the bicarbonate, and it's going to go through a duct into the duodenum for digestion. Whereas the pancreas also has little islands of cells that are the endocrine cells that are actually going to be secreting hormones. And so these go directly into the bloodstream. And so these have no ducts. These are ductless glands. Okay. And so anything that's secreting hormones would be considered an endocrine gland. And a hormone is really a chemical signal. And so again, sometimes the gland might secrete a hormone into the bloodstream that might be carried completely to another target somewhere else far away in the body. And so there are four kinds of hormones. Prostaglandins are really the ones that have more kind of a local effect. And so maybe anywhere from during labor and delivery, there are prostaglandins secreted. Menstrual cramps, are influenced by prostaglandins as well. So, different ibuprofens and aspirins and things like that can counter those prostaglandins. The pheromones are kind of an interesting ones. These really influence other individuals' behavior. So there's been a couple really interesting studies on pheromones in humans, one dealing with ovulation. So they actually took men and they had them sleep in the same t-shirts for night after night after night, get them nice and ripe and sweaty. And then they bagged those into Ziplocs. And then they had women who were having infertility issues open those bags and, take a big whiff in, and actually it caused them to ovulate. Just smelling those male pheromones in the sweat of the males caused them to ovulate. Or another example, if there's a lot of women in your house, or maybe if you go off to college and move into a sorority house where there's a lot of women, A lot of times it could even impact their menstrual cycle, where everybody's cycle will be in sync. And so again, those are pheromones that are exhibited. And there's even, you can get on Amazon, they actually sell colognes that supposedly have pheromones in there and can influence people's behavior. So, maybe that can help you get a date or something. So it's kind of fun to read the reviews on some of those pheromones on Amazon. But then the main ones that we're going to be talking about are peptide hormones and steroid hormones. And so when you see peptide, remember, think protein. And just like you've known before, proteins are big. And so these are too big to actually enter the target cells. And so instead, they'll bind to a receptor on the outside of the cell and cause some kind of a change in shape of that receptor, which will be communicated to genes inside that cell to respond. Whereas steroid hormones, remember, steroids are lipids. And since the cell membrane is majority lipids, these actually do enter the cell and have a direct impact on the genes of that cell. Okay, so most of our hormones are going to fall under the peptide and the steroid categories. So here are the major glands. Notice that we're going to divide up the pituitary into the posterior and the anterior one, and same thing with the adrenal glands. We'll break it up into the medulla and the cortex. So to start off with, the hypothalamus says helps control body temp, helps control water balance, control secretions of other endocrine glands. Remember, this is the main control center for this whole entire system. So for example, the hypothalamus, I'll give you one example here. Remember, it's going to secrete something. Let's say, for example, it's going to secrete a thyroid regulating hormone, okay, or thyroid releasing hormone. And that is going to impact the anterior pituitary. And basically it communicates to the pituitary that it's time to release its hormone called thyroid stimulating hormone, which finally is going to then travel to the thyroid, and that's going to tell the thyroid when to release its hormones. So we could really modify this pathway and, change it to maybe instead of a thyroid releasing hormone, now it's a gonadotropin releasing hormone, which impacts the anterior pituitary, and now it releases, its hormones, FSH, LH, which are going to impact the gonads, the ovary or the testes. Okay, so we can just keep modifying this main hormone here, and then you're going to see a chain of events that follows. Again, the hypothalamus is just really that main kind of big daddy of this whole system. Okay, so one of my favorites is a pineal gland. It's kind of a love-hate relationship. It is located in the brain, and it secretes a hormone called melatonin. You can buy melatonin over the counter. It's a sleep aid. But as you can see here, during the winter time, here's the melatonin secretion. And you'll notice it's secreted when it's dark out. So in the winter, we're well aware of how very little daylight we get. And so we've got a lot of melatonin being secreted. And that's why, we find that we're a lot more sleepy in the winter time. Okay, more darkness, more sleepiness. Compared to the summer months, we like to stay up a little later. We've got a lot more energy in the summertime. We're getting out and about and enjoying all those long days. And again, you'll see that the melatonin secretion is a lot shorter. And so some of the experiments they've done is, here someone is resting and sleeping. And in this case here, they give this poor sleeper here some bursts of light. And so if you watch during that burst of light right here, that melatonin just really drops off. So sometimes people take melatonin if they're having trouble sleeping, or maybe they're going to, travel to a new time zone, and they want to prevent jet lag or something like that. They want to be able to sleep on the plane, so they take some melatonin. And so a disorder that you may be aware of. I don't know. I feel like I have it now. We've had a kind of a week now without having any sunlight. So if you know someone that gets a little sad, it's seasonal affective disorder, where basically if they have multiple days of cloudy skies, no sunlight, and they get a little depressed, or maybe even during the winter months because of those short days, they get a little winter depression. That's the pineal gland. So sometimes people will even have light boxes in their house or in their offices at work to help with some of that depression. So for the pituitary, the posterior is really kind of a slacker because notice it doesn't produce these two hormones. They're actually produced by the hypothalamus. They're just stored in the posterior pituitary. So you've seen ADH before. So maybe stop the tape and see if you can quiz yourself and write down what it does. Remember, ADH stands for anti-diuretic, and anything that's a diuretic is going to make you go to the bathroom more often. So an anti-diuretic is remember, going to decrease your urine output, and it does that by increasing water reabsorption, and specifically in the collecting duct of that nephron. Okay, it changes that permeability, so more water is reabsorbed. So that's one of them. This one's going to help with water balance. And then oxytocin in women is really, it's the one that causes the uterine contractions. And so if you know somebody that's, maybe past their due date, or maybe their doctor just doesn't want to get woken up in the middle of the night, they might schedule their due date and go in and maybe get an IV of Pitocin, which is a synthetic oxytocin. So you might be surprised to know that men have this hormone as well. Even though they don't have a uterus, they're not going to be giving birth to any babies. And so they think that maybe the effect that this has on men is that it actually, we do see a spike in it when a delivery happens. So we think that maybe it has something to do with bonding. So they look in the eyes of that baby and have a connection and be a better parent. Now this is the big one here. The anterior pituitary, you'll note, has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 hormones. This one here we can just kind of check off for right now. We're going to hit this more when we get to the reproductive system, but since this deals with the impact on the ovaries and testes. But sometimes the name will give it away. So for example, the thyroid stimulating hormone, it's not surprising that this stimulates the thyroid. Adrenocorticotropic hormone, this one stimulates, I wish they would have kept kind of that ACSH maybe, stimulates the adrenal cortex. Okay, so again, that's going to be the signal to the cortex of the adrenal gland to secrete its hormone. When you see melanocyte, that's the melanin cell. Okay, so melanocyte stimulating hormone, this is the one that helps you tan. Okay, and this one exactly what it sounds like. Growth hormone is growth of bones and muscles. And then prolactin, when you see lactin there, hopefully you're thinking lactose, lactating, and prolactin is the one that causes the production of milk. Okay, so those are anterior pituitary hormones. Here's a few disorders, again, related to the human growth hormone. If somebody has too little growth hormone as a child, that can result in being a dwarf. So we call that pituitary dwarfism. On the other end of that is, again, if they have too much growth hormone, especially during their childhood years, that can lead to giganticism. So here we've got a giant here. And you'll notice overall that he actually is tall all over. So he actually has enlarged bones throughout his whole entire body. Compared to acromegaly, I'll show you a picture on the next slide. Here, they don't really increase that growth hormone until they're an adult. And so that really just causes enlarged bones, really just in the face, their fingers and toes. Okay, so if you take a look here, really, this is the same patient, just at different ages. So here she is at age 9. Age 16 still doesn't really look, anything abnormal. So here she's really done growing. And then for some reason, maybe she has a pituitary tumor, and so she starts to secrete excess growth hormone. So notice starting at age 33, and then even worsening here at age 52, and she's showing us her hands so we can see how large her hands are. But notice how big the bones of her face are. Almost starts to kind of look more masculine because maybe has more muscle attachments on those large bones. Okay, so that's acromegaly. And again, that's just an increase of growth hormone, but specifically during the adult years. Now we get to the thyroid, and I would imagine that this is probably a pretty common issue in people's family. A lot of times it is inherited as well, thyroid disorders. But remember, the special thing about the thyroid is really it's the only place in the body that takes in iodine. And so when you take in iodized salt, it bounces off everything in the body except for that thyroid. And the thyroid needs that iodine in order to make its 2 hormones. And so there's thyroxine, which is really going to be, again, growth, bones and muscles, and then also metabolism is affected. Okay, and then calcitonin we've seen and was actually just on one of your quizzes. Remember, calcitonin, it kind of gives it away here in the word. It kind of sounds like calcium. This is the hormone that decreases blood calcium. So when it's too high in the blood, it'll put it away into storage or cause a lot of it to be excreted in urine and waste. Okay, so here's some thyroid abnormalities. If you know someone that's had a simple goiter, basically the thyroid can enlarge. Usually that's due to a nutritional lack of iodine. So not probably an issue in the United States because we have iodized salt. But if somebody was maybe eating just sea salt, there's no iodine in sea salt, or maybe in another country where they have some malnutrition, they can have a simple goiter. Hypothyroidism is in this case an underactive thyroid. And so if that happens maybe like during pregnancy or as a child, we used to call this cretinism, but basically the thyroid doesn't develop properly. And so usually these individuals are short, kind of stocky individuals. They might have, a pretty severe intellectual disability. Because again, this is happening, as the brain is developing as well. Mixed edema is the adult form of this. So again, the congenital is infant or child form, and then the mixed edema is adult. My husband has this on his side of the family, and it's, some of the symptoms that are most common, they're extremely lethargic, just really a lack of energy. They could have some unexplained, weight gain. Sometimes their hair will get really thin, so they could have some loss of hair. Sometimes, their skin can get kind of puffy, and, maybe just really cold all the time because that metabolism has really slowed down. So maybe the decrease in body temp as well. Compare that to hyperthyroidism. In this case, the thyroid is too active, it's hyperactive. And individuals here, I've got a picture on the next page of somebody who has this kind of a goiter here, and basically they end up, there's some hyperactivity. They can have some trouble sleeping, so maybe some insomnia. They could have kind of a protrusion of eyes. And again, sometimes this can be caused by a thyroid tumor. So those cells are pumping out way too much thyroxine hormone. And so that's what's causing that. So here we've got a pretty pronounced, just simple goiter. Again, lack of iodine. This little infant here would have the congenital hypothyroidism. So they were really deprived of that main growth and metabolism hormone as they were developing. And here is the adult form of the hyperthyroidism. So you'll notice basically what's happening here is they have some swelling in that eye socket. And then due to that, that kind of makes those eyes protrude out a little bit. This one will probably become a favorite because the gland is called the parathyroid. And it has one hormone, and it's called the parathyroid hormone, or PTH. So that's a nice one. Again, this does the exact opposite of calcitonin. So this is the one that's going to increase blood calcium when calcium levels in the blood are too low. So again, taking it from the bone, taking it from the kidneys, taking it from the intestines, trying to scrape up as much calcium as possible for muscle contraction. Okay, so this should look familiar to you. Again, you'll see calcitonin and the parathyroid hormone just balance each other. Again, here's kind of that teeter-totter, trying to keep homeostasis, trying to keep that normal blood calcium. And so anytime it's too high, calcitonin kicks in to bring it back down. Anytime the calcium levels get too low, parathyroid hormone kicks in, and that should hopefully bring it back up. Okay, so we have two hormones that will kind of try to balance that. Think back to one of our first body systems we studied, and that was the lymphatic system. And so here's our thymus gland, again, right behind your sternum in that pericardial sac. By the heart. This one kind of parallels your immune system. So it starts out small, it gets larger and larger and larger as you are really developing your immune system. So, you know, as you go to public school and you were exposed to other children that have colds and flus and things like that, your thymus is gonna get larger and larger, and then it starts to atrophy. It really starts to get smaller as an adult. And so the hormones here are just kind of a generic class that we call thymosins. And those are specifically going to help in the maturation of lymphocytes. So kind of think about B and T cells. Remember, the B cells stay in the bone marrow, whereas the T lymphocytes, the T cells, are the ones that mature here. Adrenals, when you think of adrenal, I want you to think of stress. Okay, they're going to have everything to do with stress, emotional stress, physical stress, any kind of stress at all in your life. And so these are the little triangles that sit on top of your kidneys. And there are two parts. There's the medulla and the cortex. Okay, so I'm actually going to start with the cortex region. Remember, if you look back at your anterior pituitary and those 7 hormones that it has, one of which is called ACTH. And so this is the one that stimulates the adrenal cortex. Okay, so remember, just like in the kidney, the cortex is more of the outer portion. The medulla is more in the middle. And the medulla is actually controlled by the nervous system. And this one is going to do with short-term stress. This is fight or flight. Okay. And so that, remember, is your sympathetic nervous system. So we're going to talk about the medulla first. And the medulla is going to be, short-term stress. Okay, so an emergency situation, which we call fight or flight, If you want to think of adrenal, think of adrenaline or epinephrine. That's just a synonym for that. And so these hormones here are going to, increase your heart rate. They're going to dilate the blood vessels, so more blood can be delivered to your skeletal muscles. They're going to dilate your airways so that you can get more oxygen to those skeletal muscles. Okay, and you could put down it's going to increase your blood pressure. Okay, all the things that would happen, whether this is you are truly getting in a fight or you're running away from emergency situations. Sometimes if, people have to do public speaking, they kind of go into this fight or flight mode, even though there's no danger. But maybe you've experienced, kind of an increased heart rate when you have to do a speech in class. The cortex then is really long-term stress. So that's really, that could be college, that could be family stuff. Paying for college, you name it. It's not a quick fix like fight or flight is. And so there's going to be two main types of hormones here. There's mineral corticoids and glucocorticoids. The mineral one is aldosterone, is the specific one. And this is the one that's going to be secreted. This is going to impact the kidney, and this is going to help with water and salt balance in the body. Okay. And the example of glucocorticoids is called cortisol. Okay. Cortisol is really something that helps to suppress the body's, inflammatory response. So it really, reduces inflammation. So if you're thinking, I took a cortisone shot, maybe for a skin rash or some kind of irritation or inflammation that you had. Cortisol reduces inflammation, but in doing so, it really increases your susceptibility to infection as well. So that's why they usually put a limit on how many of these you can actually get. Okay. The other thing to think about too is the connection to alcohol. Drinking alcohol does increase your cortisol levels. Okay, and in doing so, it causes more fat to be deposited, and so that's why people that drink a lot of alcohol eventually get a beer gut. So here's a couple disorders that affect the adrenal glands. The first is Addison's disease, and that's, again, they have a low secretion, a hyposecretion of those glucocorticoids. And a good example of that is actually, here's JFK. He secretly had Addison's disease when he was campaigning for president back in the 60s. He suffered from a lot of these symptoms, and they said it was just, they never said it was Addison's disease, that, because they didn't want people to know that he wasn't healthy enough to be president. But he would have times where he would get dizzy and pass out on the campaign trail. And they said it was just the rigors of the campaign trail. But in actuality, he had Addison's disease, which actually can be fatal. Basically, they can't, if they get in a stressful situation, glucose cannot be replenished because they have such a low secretion of glucocorticoids. So it can actually be fatal. You also notice here, he seems really tan, and that's actually one of the symptoms as well of some people that have Addison's disease, because it also, they build up melanin because of the pituitary's effects. So sometimes it is an autoimmune thing most of the time, but some of the cases can be attributed to tuberculosis. That's what TB is. And this little boy here has what's called Cushing's syndrome, and in this case, it's the exact opposite of what JFK had. So now we have a hypersecretion. So basically, he kind of looks like he's been drinking a lot of alcohol. He's got a lot of this fat deposition, and probably if we could see his tummy, we would see a big gut there. But basically, he has excess glucocorticoids, excess cortisol, And so that's why we see that there's a lot of extra subcutaneous fat, a lot of belly fat. And actually, this is the same little boy. It doesn't look like the same little man. He looks a lot happier in this other picture. But this was basically about 4 months after he started treatment. So 4 months of treatment. So now he looks like a pretty happy young man. The next gland is the pancreas, located below the stomach. And again, remember I mentioned that it does actually have endocrine and exocrine functions. So we use the term heterocrine to say that it's both. Okay, so we've seen its digestive function. These little islets of Langerhans, are the ones that secrete the hormones. And the two hormones I want you to know are insulin and glucagon. And so you'll see on the next page, again, these are going to help to maintain homeostasis or balance. So insulin is secreted in response to a high blood sugar level. So their job is going to bring that blood sugar or blood glucose level back down after you've had a meal high in carbs. And then glucagon is after periods of, maybe fasting or starvation, where blood glucose gets a little low. Glucagon is going to bring it back up. So you'll notice these two will balance each other as well. Okay. So taking a look at that again, here's kind of that normal blood glucose. I've kind of clipped it off up here, but basically insulin would be secreted anytime the blood sugar level is too high. And so instead of keeping that blood sugar level high in the blood, which would be damaging to many of our organs, especially the heart and the kidneys and the eyes, and so we can put it into storage. And so the stored sugar is called glycogen. And really glycogen is put into storage both by the liver and your muscle cells. Okay, so it's basically socking it away for later. And then the bad news is that we also store some of that in adipose tissue, which we know is fat. So that's going to be excess. And then on the other hand, if we're in between meals or maybe you've been fasting, glucagon is the one that's going to take that stored glycogen out of the liver and the muscle cells and put it back as glucose into the bloodstream. And again, this is the good news here, is that some of that will be broken down and released, so it's not stored as fat. So we've talked about diabetes quite a bit. This number is just staggering, to think 18 million people just in the United States have diabetes. So these are some of the symptoms. Frequent urination, again, remember they have very, very high levels of glucose. And in order to kind of flush that excess glucose out, they're really thirsty, very much so. Have a very unexplained change in weight. Left untreated can really affect vision. We've got several individuals that work at nursing homes. They probably have seen diabetics that just really have a hard time healing and are extremely fatigued. So long-term effects, again, from people who don't regulate their diabetes, it's so damaging on the organs. They can have kidney and heart problems. They can have to have amputations because of poor circulation and poor healing. So diabetes is definitely something to take very serious and get treatment. So type 1 is the one, a lot of times we call it juvenile diabetes, but we can have adults that are diagnosed with type 1. It is autoimmune. So it's not anything that they're doing with their diet. It just means the immune system has attacked these islets, and so they cannot produce insulin. And so these are insulin dependent people. They're checking their blood sugar, injecting themselves with insulin. It usually does have an early onset. And so that's why a lot of times they call this juvenile diabetes. Type 2, which a few years ago, one of my favorite actors, Tom Hanks, said that he actually suffers from type 2 diabetes. This is the most common type. We're pretty fat, pretty happy in the United States how we eat. So not surprising this is more common in the US. But basically, because of an unregulated diet, the cells get to a point where they just don't respond to insulin anymore. They're just not receptive to it. And so the cells are needing glucose and they're not getting it. And so they are kind of screaming at the pancreas saying, come on, crank out some insulin. And so it produces insulin, but again, the cells just don't respond to it. So usually if we start to see, yearly blood tests starting to show, kind of a slight rise in blood sugar in between tests, and they start to say maybe they are pre-diabetic, then they can make some changes with their diet and their exercise, and maybe even get to a point where they aren't truly a diabetic because they can regulate it with diet and exercise. Again, we'll study ovaries and testes in the next chapter, so we can kind of skip through that. And then the last part of this deals, sometimes there are hormones that are secreted from other tissues. And so again, here's our friend EPO, which is that butter that we've talked about at various times of the semester. Remember, it comes from the kidney, and that causes the bone marrow to stimulate production of erythrocytes, or red blood cells, RBCs. And usually it does that in times of low oxygen. Your fat cells actually secrete something. It's a hormone called leptin. And what it does, it triggers the kind of the lever in the hypothalamus that says, you're full, stop eating. And so leptin has actually, not surprisingly, been manufactured by companies trying to help people control their appetite. So they get that feeling of being full. And so they don't consume as many calories. So it's a great weight loss hormone. I mentioned prostaglandins. Those are kind of those they have local effects. So I mentioned labor, menstrual cramps. Those are prostaglandins. So this kind of ends the PowerPoint. You have a content frame that I provided in class that would be a great one to use. Quizlet would be a great one for this one. Again, really focus on matching the gland to the hormone or hormones, in many cases, that it secretes, the functions of those hormones, and then in some cases even the disorders. So it's a lot of factual recall. So practice, because it's a lot of memorization.